With the scariest places in America, we traversed the country, seeking out the most terrifying locales in all the United States. Now, it's time to go global. With castles haunted by unspeakable atrocities.
He was said to practice cannibalism, to have boiled people alive, to have burned them alive.
To an island populated by the world's creepiest residents.
These mangled, messed up dolls are everywhere.
And every abandoned prison and creepy catacomb in between. We're seeking out the 10 scariest places in the world. Places whose paranormal activity and fright-inducing vibes are well documented, both throughout history and today on social media, where terror-seeking tourists hope to catch a glimpse of the ghoulish.
Guys, we found it. This is it. This is Lily's room.
Each location is guaranteed to make your skin crawl.
Originally, the building was not meant to be a house of horrors.
There were so many deaths, it was just a murderous environment.
All these haunted locations have the perfect recipe to scare the living shit out of you.
Our first location is in the heart of Eastern Europe and the inspiration for arguably the most famous horror movie villain of all time. Coming in at number 10 on our list, Bran Castle, aka the birthplace of the legend of Dracula.
Bran's castle sits on top of a mountain overlooking Transylvania. It's connected to Vlad the Dracul, and a lot of people connect it to Bram Stoker's Dracula.
It was built in its current state in about the 14th century. It's really imposing in its construction. It was built right on the edge of a 200-foot cliff.
It brings all the vibes that you would want for a spooky castle where a blood-sucking vampire would be from.
Beyond the tales of vampires, the castle itself was born out of bloodshed.
Bran Castle was built to protect and ward off the invading Ottoman Turks.
The castle was very important as a strategic military castle to stop the invasion of the enemies.
But as you tour Bran Castle, it quickly becomes clear its sole purpose wasn't merely for defense.
There's also a torture chamber at the castle that you can still see today that was used to torture and murder prisoners and enemies of Romania. It was also used as a prison. The fact that all this torture came from this castle makes it extremely terrifying.
I think it is certainly one of the most haunted places in the world because it has that dichotomy. People can go there and enjoy it for what it is and the purpose it served in history and the relics that it still houses. But if you listen closely, if you look closely, you will very easily find, hear, possibly see tormented souls of the very large number of people that did lose their lives there.
Beyond the cries from the tortured souls of long-dead prisoners, what truly makes Bran Castle so scary is its connection to one of the most prolific and sadistic killers in all of history, Vlad the Impaler.
Vlad the Impaler, Vlad Tepes, best way to put it, most accurate way to put it, a sadistic, ruthless warlord.
He used to impale the families that they betrayed him. He used to cut them in pieces and boil them in water.
Vlad the Impaler executed over 80,000 people.
To demonstrate his strength and his superiority, Vlad the Impaler would actually drink the blood of his enemies as a power move.
Men, women, children, if you were in his way, he was going to get you out of his way.
His nickname was Dracula, which actually means son of Dracul, and his father was Dracul, which means dragon.
His nicknames were pretty fitting. He was a very bloodthirsty prince.
In 1476, Vlad was killed in battle. And upon his death, tales of his bloodthirsty ways mingled with local legends about vampires. Stories of a vicious Count Dracul began spreading throughout Transylvania. Tales of Vlad rising from the dead and summoning his soldiers, feasting nightly on the blood of their enemies.
There's very rich folklore coming out of Romania, and the people there have a very strong belief of vampires, and they call them strigoi.
They were said to live normal lives or said to be out and about per usual, but when the nighttime hit, they would go out and the evil spirits would overtake them and they would go and feast on the people of the village. And at sunrise, they would just return back to their normal selves.
In the 1800s, those legends made their way to the ears of Irish novelist Bram Stoker, who turned them into the Gothic horror novel, Dracula.
In Bram's book, Dracula, he writes about this intimidating kind of mysterious man who drinks the blood of the people that he kills, and the only way he can kill him is driving a stake through his heart, and obviously that's loosely based around the events of Vlad the Impaler.
Soon after its release, readers began connecting the castle in the book to Bran Castle.
Bram Castle is a spitting image of the castle in the novel Dracula, because, as he writes, it's a castle sitting upon a pier of rocks overlooking a valley with a river running beneath.
If you give near real descriptions and depictions of things, and you also intertwine their own personal lore inside of that, now you're creating a cyclone of, is it real, is it not, maybe it's real.
But it wasn't until the dawn of the motion picture that the legend of Dracula and the terror-inducing Bran Castle truly went global.
Vampires are no secret to be a big part of popular culture, even today. A lot of movies, a lot of different TV series.
When you have a character that is dead but immortal, you can do so much with it storytelling-wise, which is why, you know, we have so many iterations of Dracula. You know, Francis Ford Coppola with Bram Stoker's Dracula, Interview with a Vampire, the Twilight series.
And look at the place, look at that. That shadow of it, look, it's just like a shadow.
If you visit Bran Castle today, it's clear it doesn't shy away from the connection to the very real and very terrifying original Dracula, whose spirit, as documented in videos on social media, seems to permeate the entire citadel.
I thought it said
It didn't say Vlad.
That said Vlad.
No, it's blood.
Vlad the Impaler is a terrifying man, and Bran Castle is just terrifying all around.
Up next on our list, a prison that's allegedly haunted by the spirits of some of the world's most notorious criminals.
This was meant to break your humanity and what it meant to be human.
For number 9 on our countdown, we venture from Transylvania to the icy, shark-infested waters of California's San Francisco Bay, and one of the most notorious prisons in the entire world, Alcatraz.
Alcatraz is definitely one of the scariest places in the world. Alcatraz was created to basically break people.
Alcatraz in itself is very imposing, just the size of it as you approach. I'm sure no prisoner was happy to be escorted into Alcatraz. Some of them thought they would never come out. Some of them were right.
There was something a lot darker at Alcatraz that was born from everything that happened there in its operation.
Alcatraz was originally built as a base for the United States Army before it was converted into a military prison in the mid-1800s, and quickly earned a reputation as a home of true horrors.
It's very troublesome, some of the punishments that were inflicted on these soldiers as examples, you know, for other soldiers.
The guards used to put prisoners naked into a cell and turn up the air conditioning so that it was absolutely freezing inside and they could sit in there for days and just freeze and starve.
In the 1930s, the massive structure was acquired by the U.S. Bureau of Prisons, where it housed some of America's most violent criminals.
The only people who ever wound up at Alcatraz were those so notoriously ruthless, cruel, untamable by other prisons all around the U.S. that they had to be transferred somewhere with a higher capacity for locking them away from the world.
The inmates from Alcatraz were extremely violent. They would harm the other inmates, they would harm the guards. Just a lot of darker energy is there.
Some of the most notorious prisoners that were housed there included George Machine Gun Kelly was an infamous bootlegger. Al Capone, Scarface, was imprisoned there as well.
The treatment at Alcatraz was actually among some of the harshest conditions that you could have in a prison system. They were heavily shackled.
Alcatraz, sort of the longer it was there, the more cruel it became. So this was kind of built into this experience of Alcatraz.
Al Capone spent the better part of his 5 years on Alcatraz in the hospital. He exhibited signs of syphilis and was taken up to the hospital where he would be assaulted. And he was in several fights up in the hospital. The hospital had cages in the hallway that would be similar to something you might put your dog in. And those were used as punishment where you could only sit cross-legged.
Perhaps the most terrifying and most inhumane area of the prison was the basement, AKA the dungeon.
The first prisoners were brought to Alcatraz were kept in that basement room, windowless basement room. They slept on wood flooring with straw, no pillows, no blankets, into that deep, dark holding cell where, 18 to 30 men, we believe, were kept at a time down in that space.
The terrible conditions drove some prisoners insane and made others willing to do just about anything to get out.
During the 29 years that Alcatraz was U.S. Penitentiary Alcatraz, 8 prisoners were shot and killed attempting to escape. I believe a total of 3 guards died during escape attempts. One was bludgeoned with a hammer over in the shops where the prisoners were allowed to work.
There was just a lot happening on site where it was just a murderous environment.
Even when the bodies are gone, it's believed that the spirits just still linger.
Not only did deaths imprint the very foundation of this island and leave a lasting supernatural impression, it made an entryway, a lot of people believe, for something a lot darker to kind of take hold, to feed off of that torment, to feed off of that misery, far before the prison even closed its doors.
There's this one cell. One of the prisoners claimed that he saw something come at him in his cell one night with glowing red eyes, almost like an animal.
And finally, he was found dead inside of his cell. They believe killed himself, but there are a lot of speculations that didn't necessarily happen, and it was something more closely tied to whatever it is he was claiming to see.
Visiting Alcatraz is not for the faint of heart. It's somewhere that will scare you if small confined spaces bothers you, if the thought of malevolent forces bothers you, if the thoughts of being, touched or whispered to or hearing screams or just being in a dark place with little to no electricity. If that's something that scares you, then this place is definitely going to be very high on your list.
With all these tales of abuse, death, and demonic activity, it's no wonder Alcatraz has become popular with ghost hunters, documenting their visits to the island on social media.
Come with me to tour one of the most infamous prisons in the U.S., Alcatraz Island.
There were many prisoners still here, walking around, hollering, and even working.
With so many desperate enough to risk their lives for the chance to escape Alcatraz, why then are there so many ghosts reported to still hang around the island?
I've had several of my visitors faint, and basically when we kind of revived them, they would say, gosh, in both cases, they said I had this heaviness on my chest. Looking into those dark cells, on a particular occasion, I had a family, and they were getting a kind of a private tour of the dungeon cells. I was in mid-sentence, and all of a sudden, we all heard the sound. It sounded like a woman in high heels or clogs, some kind of wooden shoes or something, coming down the central hallway of the building. And I literally stopped in mid-sentence and said, hello? And the footsteps stopped, you know, and nobody's supposed to be down there. And so I quickly said, excuse me, and kind of dashed over to look down the hallway, and there was nothing there. And to this day, you know, I can't explain it.
I think what draws people to want to go and do a tour at Alcatraz and see for themselves the insides of this prison is, of course, the well-known people that were there and what they were in there for, but also for the possibility, will they see something demonic? Will something go flying across the cell room when they run an experiment?
Up next on our list, another castle. One that's seen more warfare than any in Europe. And is just down the road from a place that witnessed hundreds of deaths, courtesy of the bubonic plague.
Given what happened there with all the deaths, it's no surprise that this area would become an epicenter of paranormal activity.
We're counting down the scariest places in the world, and Alcatraz Island came in at number 9, and is arguably one of the scariest places in the United States. But here's some other terrifying American locales that just barely missed the list. The Queen Mary, a gargantuan cruise ship turned wartime destroyer that saw more than its fair share of death. Today, nearly every inch of it is awash in paranormal activity.
I did hear keys, like janitor keys. Are you scared?
Yes. And there's the Tonopah Cemetery, a haunted graveyard in a Nevada ghost town that happens to sit right next to a motel decked out in demonic clowns.
Dude, that just started moving out of nowhere and then it stopped. What the hell?
And finally, a home many believe is the scariest place in America, Lemp Mansion. A sprawling Victorian residence built on top a system of super spooky caves. A house where not one, not two, but 4 members of the same family committed suicide and are said to still roam the halls. Now, back to our official tour of the world's scariest places. We're headed to another castle, and in truth, an entire town that's steeped in tales of gruesome deaths and harrowing paranormal encounters. Edinburgh, Scotland, and the infamous Edinburgh Castle.
Edinburgh Castle is the stronghold that sits above the city of Edinburgh in Scotland, and it kind of looms above the city landscape.
Edinburgh Castle has been there for 1,100 years. It is one of the most besieged fortresses in the world.
It's said that the souls of those killed in the dozens of battles fought in and around the castle still haunt its halls today. Perhaps the most well-known ghost is the Grey Lady, said to be the spirit of a Scottish noblewoman named Janet Douglas.
And it is said that her brother had a disagreement with James V of Scotland, and he ended up taking that out on Janet. He had Lady Janet accused of witchcraft. Not only was Lady Janet accused of witchcraft, but she was also accused of poisoning her husband, as well as plotting against James V of Scotland.
When they couldn't find evidence against her, her servants and her attendants and members of her household were tortured until they agreed to testify against her. So she was convicted of treason and witchcraft.
And on July 17th, 1537, Janet was burned at the stake. What was even more heartbreaking about all of this and more traumatic was her 16-year-old son was forced to watch this. I can't imagine the level of trauma that was inflicted, how much damage he went through psychologically.
One of the paranormal stories is connected to the Piper. With the castle, there are tunnels, and people say that the Piper used to go down there with his bagpipe, and playing would allow people to know how far he was in the tunnel.
They had him play as he went through the tunnel, just so that those above ground could keep track of where they were and follow on foot on the surface to see where it is the tunnels led.
But then suddenly, the bagpipes stopped. And the team that he was working with was concerned, so they went down into the tunnels to try to find him, but he was never seen again.
There wasn't even a body. But to this day, people can hear bagpipe music coming up from the ground, following at different directions of the castle.
Edinburgh Castle seems to be bursting at the seams with ghosts. You have the long and complicated history of the location, plus you have all of the trauma that occurred on site.
But it's not just the castle that was home to so much death. Another place in the city that's seen its fair share of horror and ghostly hauntings is Mary King's Close, which lies in the valley below the castle.
The very bottom of the hill of Edinburgh were the poorest areas of the city, and perpendicular to the main streets ran closes.
A close is basically just a very long, very narrow street that we have here in Scotland, where people live, work, gather, and they've been existing in Edinburgh pretty much since Edinburgh was ever founded.
And in the 17th century, one of the most infamous closes in Edinburgh was named after a popular merchant, Mary King.
Mary King's Close had up to 600 people living there at a time.
Mary King's Close was basically like tenement housing. A lot of the lower income people lived there. They were in close quarters, which caused a lot of health issues for everyone.
The bubonic plague hit Edinburgh in the year of 1645. It was the worst plague that Edinburgh ever saw.
The bubonic plague was no joke at the time. It was highly contagious. They had the sores, these black and red spots on their skin. They had swollen lymph nodes, and essentially they were treated like lepers. People didn't want to come near them.
As soon as the plague was announced in Edinburgh, the city officials and those who came from more money fled the city immediately. The city went into full-on lockdown so that nobody else was allowed to leave. If you were caught trying to leave, you would be fined. All these people are trapped in a very, very small amount of space with a deadly disease spreading.
After the plague subsided, the city of Edinburgh sealed off Mary King's Close for good, but not before nearly every single one of its residents died of the disease. In the 1990s, after more than 350 years, the Close, where so many people had perished, was reopened to the public, replete with mannequins detailing life inside the tenements in unnerving relief. Within days of the reopening of Mary King's Close, the accounts of paranormal encounters started rolling in.
You have these people now going into this reopened area and experiencing what life was like underground in this very compact area. And so they hear voices, they have cold sensations come through, they actually see people who are not fully formed.
People have felt burning sensations, feeling like those sores, getting parts of their skin cut off and possibly burned off.
Helplessness haunts the place. That's where you get the sense of dread. You feel the emotions they felt back then, and you feel the fate that they felt back then, and it's hard to avoid it.
In 1992, a Japanese medium came and visited the close, and she encountered a spirit whom she was communicating with. And she believed the spirit was that of a little girl named Annie, who died from the plague.
She found out that this little girl had lost her favorite doll. And keeping in accordance with Japanese traditions, this psychic medium did end up going to the store to buy a doll for Annie.
She gives the doll to this little child, Annie. As soon as she does, the feelings of sadness and loss and hopelessness are lifted from the room.
She said, as long as this doll is here, Annie's spirit will be at rest.
And lots of guests go in and they say that they can feel Annie in this room.
Edinburgh Castle and Mary King's Close are both scary places, but for very different reasons. The ghosts that haunt the castles, you can put names to faces and to spirits and have these records of these very specific, very traumatic experiences. And then you have almost the complete opposite in Mary King's Close. It's much more of a human trauma, like this kind of collective experience that took place here.
From a haunted Scottish castle, we head to the sands of North Africa, to the oldest of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and definitely the most haunted. It's a royal burial ground, housing a host of ghosts and a series of Indiana Jones-style booby traps, all designed to scare off invaders and protect the mummified remains of Egyptian pharaohs. Welcome to the Pyramids of Giza.
The Pyramids of Giza are best known as the royal tombs for 3 different pharaohs, but also the land surrounding the Pyramids of Giza is essentially one big graveyard for some of Egypt's most notorious and well-known pharaohs and royalty.
The reason why they're terrifying, weirdly enough, even though they're a tourist attraction, is because of their association with the dead. There's also been some paranormal sightings around these pyramids as well.
Built over the course of roughly 60 years, the Pyramids of Giza are approximately 4,500 years old. Their construction was overseen by the pharaohs, Khufu, Khafra, and Menkaura.
It took 30,000 people to do, right? Thousands and thousands of people who just devoted themselves to this project.
It's estimated that each one took about 10,000 people to create in a span of decades.
It is believed that several hundred, if not thousands, died during the construction of the pyramids.
The reason the Egyptians were building the pyramids were just to prepare themselves for the afterlife.
The largest of the pyramids is known simply as the Great Pyramid, a haunting maze designed to protect the tomb of the mummified body of King Khufu at all costs.
Of the 35 pyramids built in its era, the Great Pyramid is an aberration. The only pyramid to have a tomb laying in the heart of the pyramid, not at ground level or underground. Its internal structure is also bizarre. A maze of tunnels and chambers unlike any other.
In ancient Egyptian mummification, the brain would be removed, but also important organs like the heart, the liver. These organs were removed and put in sacred jars. And the body would be put in a sarcophagus, and there would be these lavish funeral rites. And these sarcophagi would be put underground.
The ancient Egyptian belief was that whatever you were buried with during the mummification process, you would also have access to in the afterlife. So of course, for pharaohs and wealthy people, it was members of their household. It was their favorite pets. It was chariots. It was all the gold and riches that they had in life because they believed they would have access to that in death.
The pharaohs and the workers who built the Great Pyramid made sure that if any intruder tried to rob the tomb of its riches, they would pay for it with their life.
When you think of the Great Pyramids of Giza, the one thing that might actually come to mind is how many booby traps that were actually there. You think of Indiana Jones, the Raider of the Lost Ark. That was actually kind of based upon some of those booby traps that a lot of people have, unfortunately, uncovered when going into the Great Pyramid of Giza.
That stuff seems preposterous. But in fact, it was those things were real and deadly. Between the darkness and maze and the fact that there's dozens of dead people buried around here, plus all the booby traps and the tomb of Khufu himself, not to mention the fact that the people here devoted years of transitioning into the afterlife. It's pretty damn scary.
When it comes to the pyramids of Giza, there should be no surprise that there are some paranormal encounters attached to it. So one of the most common is the Curse of the Pharaohs.
The Curse of the Pharaohs states that anyone who disturbs one of the tombs will be haunted by it for eternity. And though the pyramids are nearly 5 millennia old, reports of the curse being visited upon would-be robbers have been documented in modern times. Most notably, a team of explorers who at the dawn of the 20th century was felled by the curse.
These archaeologists that had opened up these tombs, it seems that they inadvertently unleashed the Pharaoh's curse. After several of these archaeologists were opening up tombs, they would start falling mysteriously ill, or they would die from really weird circumstances. I don't think it's an accident that they met these grisly demises.
A lot of people report seeing spirits walking around the area.
Some recent encounters have been chronicled on social media.
When I was struggling to get through the Egyptian pyramids, I couldn't help but think I was being followed.
Everyday tourists going there are seeing these bright white orbs. They'll very often hear screams. They'll hear voices that, to us, of course, are speaking in a different language coming from the pyramids.
We took some videos walking inside, but watch what happens with my phone. Look at that weird shape. What is that? Do you guys know what that is? It's kind of creepy walking into a pyramid.
Not only are these apparitions of pharaohs being seen, but also there are apparitions of people in early 20th century clothing being spotted. More specifically, the archaeologists who discovered Pharaoh Khufu's grave.
With all this well-documented activity, it's no wonder the mummified world of the Great Pyramids has taken on a life, or rather afterlife, of its own.
Mummies are probably the top horror genre trope. It has sustained over the decades. There are hundreds of mummy movies, either in motion pictures or in TV shows.
I also think about the hit film The Mummy, starring Brendan Fraser. You know, we embrace it. You know, people want to dress like a mummy for Halloween. It's a big part of our culture.
The correlation of the mummy goes back to the 1920s when King Tut's tomb was discovered. And then 10 years later, the movie The Mummy with Boris Karloff was made. You wonder where that folklore comes from. Could it be that? Possibly. Did someone really see zombie-like wrapped creatures roaming around Egypt? It's hard to say, but the folklore started and it came from somewhere.
With the co-opting of the pharaohs by Western pop culture, and with tourists running roughshod over these sacred grounds and posting video after video on YouTube and TikTok, it's no wonder there's so many terrifying paranormal encounters both in and around the pyramids.
This was very much a place that was meant to stay sacred. It was never meant to become a tourist attraction.
As long as you avoid the Pharaoh's curse and don't touch anything, you should be clear to visit one of the 7 wonders of the world.
The next location on our countdown is one that, like the grounds in and around the pyramids, houses hundreds of dead bodies. Only these are on full display.
They're just suffering eternal horror in hell.
When people think of Italy, they often think of the breathtaking art, soaring architecture, and of course, the cuisine. But beneath the aura of romance and reverence lies a plethora of scary sights that can be downright terrifying. And under the Church of Santa Maria della Pace in Palermo, Sicily, lies one of the scariest places in all of Italy, and comes in at number 6 on our list: the Capuchin Catacombs.
The Capuchin Catacombs are the underbelly of Sicily.
It is a tomb that houses hundreds, if not thousands, of bodies that are in various states of decomposition.
The catacombs in Palermo were created after the graveyard began to fill up and the monks decided to start excavating new crypts and burying the monks there in their robes.
They decided that they were going to place the friars who died previously into these caverns.
At the time of the construction, it was pretty much just a mass grave.
With the new underground graveyard complete, the monks decided to exhume the remains of their dead from the above-ground cemetery and place them in the catacombs. But when they did, they made a shocking discovery about several of the bodies.
Well, 45 of the friars actually turned into mummies, and it was a natural process. And when they dug them up, they believed that it was divine intervention, it was an act of God.
Instead of just reburying the corpses, the monks took another, far more unusual and decidedly creepier approach. They took the bones and arranged them artistically around the catacombs. And the mummified bodies of the friars were then propped against the walls and put on display.
They decided that they were going to place the friars on display. And they placed them in the catacombs. They're fully dressed. They were actually recognizable, and so they would prop them up, kind of like dolls.
So after someone passed away, their body was essentially put in a drying room, and the monks had this room with a whole centralized piping system to pump air for a certain drying process. And then the bodies were also bathed in vinegar, and they were stuffed with hay. And this is why the bodies in the Capuchin catacombs, they have hair on their head. Their face may have a very waxy look to it. Their skin may still be smooth. Eventually, the monks realized that there was a monetary gain from this. They could open this up to people willing to pay a certain price. And so it became a place of elite status if you could have your remains housed in the Capuchin catacombs.
The catacombs is said to be a who's who of Sicilian societies, and that includes professors and historians and lawyers and doctors and people who were considered valuable in their professions.
Families could pay a little extra and actually have the clothing changed out seasonably, which is kind of creepy. But it was what the family wanted.
For the next 200 years, the Capuchin catacombs interred another 7,000 bodies. And more than 1,000 mummies were put on display.
There are over 160 children that are actually placed in the catacombs, and unfortunately, there is not a lot known about them or how they passed.
There's a girl in these catacombs. Her name is Rosalia. She is the best preserved. In 1920, she died of pneumonia, and she was mummified. And today, she's actually in a glass casket, and she looks completely alive. She's garnered the nickname Sleeping Beauty.
You could see her beautiful curly hair. Her skin is like porcelain. She just looks like she's in full peace.
They look so lifelike. When you look at them, they even have different items with them, so it looks like they're just frozen in time. You might have a husband and wife who are standing there, and they're standing next to each other. They're posed with items that were part of their daily lives. They might be having a conversation.
When tourists started visiting the Capuchin catacombs, they had to start putting bars and wires around the bodies because people would break off pieces of the bones to take with them.
When you visit the Capuchin catacombs, you are going underground. And so they're caverns, and so it's very narrow. And you have 2 layers of corpses who are interred. And so if you're claustrophobic, you probably don't want to go in there.
My general sense as both an investigator and an intuitive is that the catacombs is absolutely massively haunted. There are 8,000 people buried in the Capuchin catacombs. It's almost expected to have paranormal activity.
People have reported when they left the room and then came back, the skeletons, the mummies, the bodies were in different positions.
The church was intending for this to be a place of reverence, to be a place that's sacred. It does give off kind of a spooky vibe, and maybe not the reverent vibe that people would want you to have when walking amongst all these bones.
We're halfway through our tour of terror, and the top 5 scariest places in the world are guaranteed to frighten you half to death. The Capuchin catacombs are definitely designed to creep you out. But they're not the only creepy caverns around the world. Just missing out on our top 10 are another pair of terror-inducing underground sites. The Crystal Sepulchre in the Central American country of Belize. It's a daunting maze of caves where the ancient Mayans performed ritual human sacrifices. Caves they believed also served as the entrance to hell. And for just sheer volume of dead bodies and gothic fear factor, the catacombs beneath Paris offer 200 miles of underground eeriness. With more than 6 million skeletons and enough creepy corridors to terrify you for years. Now, the next official stop on our journey to the scariest places on Earth is one that, while you may not know it by name, combines decaying architecture with remote island scenery and has made it a starring location in countless films, including the blockbuster James Bond movie, Skyfall.
Most people have a reference of the island from the 2012 film James Bond's Skyfall as being the lair of the villain, Silva.
But in reality, the island's celebrity status masks the myriad of horrors that transpired there. Horrors that are said to have spawned ghosts that haunt the crumbling buildings and abandoned workhouses to this day. Number 5, Hashima Island, Japan.
Hashima Island is actually an incorporated area very close to Nagasaki, Japan.
In the 1800s, coal was discovered on the island. Then later in the 1890s, the Mitsubishi Corporation bought the island and they developed it.
We could really compare this to the California gold rush. Everybody was rushing to Hashima Island as a worker, as an industrialist, as an owner of a company, because they saw opportunity here for wealth and growth.
They needed to accommodate people. So their intentions were to create a self-sustaining community, and in the process, they put up an apartment complex, they put up a theater, schools, and did everything they could to make sure that they were taking care of the people, at least minimally, on this island so that they could work and produce coal.
And that sort of comes to the next phase of it, where this utopian ideal sort of just disintegrates and becomes a story of tragedy, because Hashima Island, whatever it set out to be, it became something else.
Though the powers that be tried to keep working conditions on the island a secret, images of Hashima's day-to-day horrors eventually landed in the laps of various Far East news outlets, where they were made public for all to see.
Working conditions on Hashima Island were so bad that people quite literally dropped dead. They had hundreds of people die there.
At one point in its history, it was the most populated place on the planet per density. There were 5,000 people, miners plus their family members, living in this confined space, and it was maybe a kilometer long and maybe half a kilometer wide.
In the early 20th century, the Japanese Empire transformed this failed workers' utopia into one of the cruelest, most unforgiving prison colonies on Earth, where POWs from rival Asian countries replaced the Mitsubishi miners as indentured servants.
It was the perfect prison because it was an island that had a concrete wall and they couldn't escape. And so what they did was they housed Korean and Chinese prisoners of war, and they made them do slave labor. And they worked them to death.
The nature of the work that these forced laborers were going through, this island earned nicknames like Hell Island and Jail Island. A lot of these forced workers from Korea and China knew that more than likely they were not going to be leaving this island alive.
You had malnourishment, you had disease, you had poor working conditions in the mines, and you had torture, you had severe punishments. So even when you got punished, you were still obligated to go back to work.
The records are not as clear as to how many people died. The reports are up into the thousands.
The United States eventually bombed Nagasaki, and that kind of depleted any more activity on the island. So the Japanese military relented, and pretty much all function was essentially ceased at that point in time.
Though the prisoners of war were freed, the Mitsubishi Mining Company didn't entirely give up on the island's resources for several more years.
Getting closer to the 70s, the island was running out of coal, and at that point, there was no reason to continue working on the island. So the island was deserted in 1974, with the final inhabitants leaving on April 20th.
The island was abandoned. They left everything. The buildings started falling apart, and eventually the animals and the fauna just started taking back over.
It's believed that the spirits who perished on the island still roam the ruins.
Hashima Island became a place that was associated with death, above ground and below ground. And it's no surprise that pretty much the entire whole of the island is considered to be pretty haunted.
In 2009, the island opened up for tourism. Visitors to the island report having this sensation of being watched. Also, they've been touched and tapped. Just these sensations that something's there with them, kind of like a heaviness in the different locations. And this might be attributed to the souls curious as to why are you coming?
Part of the creep factor is not only the crimes against humanity, there was so many deaths there, but also the buildings are basically falling apart. Any false move, they can just fall on you.
Hashima Island is not a safe place to go to, but that doesn't stop tourists from visiting. It's become this pinnacle of abandoned places.
There's pretty much a constant flow of paranormal investigators flocking to the island looking for paranormal activity. And they're usually not very disappointed.
People who have visited the island seem to experience paranormal activity in the apartment buildings, which kind of makes sense because that's where the overcrowding was noticed.
A lot of that pain and a lot of that anguish that those people were dealing with is still lingering within that building. A lot of people have heard screaming, a lot of people have heard voices. Knowing that these people's belongings are still located in this structure make it a little bit more uneasy, simply because a lot of those items could be holding residual energy, which could be causing some of the paranormal activity that a lot of people are catching.
But it's another, more ominously named area of the island that takes the cake as Hashima's most terrifying spot.
The most terrifying place on the island is called the Stairway to Hell because it's shrouded in such anguish. There was once a school in that area, and after this massive disaster happened, the only thing that was left was this staircase. The Stairway to Hell connected a lot of the different buildings. The dead end of that walkway actually led you to the temple where the shrine was located. The shrine was created by the workers to be able to pray for health, prosperity, and to mourn their dead. People who are brave enough to venture up these staircases and walk across that pathway have been known to feel an anguish or a hellish pain, and that might be one of the main reasons why it gained the name the Stairway to Hell.
However, not every visitor to the island believes the ghosts of Hashima are truly malevolent.
I believe that these spirits do not mean anyone any harm. I think they just want to be remembered and they just want to be acknowledged and just acknowledge that they were wronged.
6 scary places down, 4 more to go. That is, if you still have the stomach for it. Next up, we're heading to London, a place with no shortage of scary locations. But perhaps no place in the city has as much twisted history as number 4 on our list. A place that's crawling with the ghosts of scores of murdered British monarchs. The Tower of London.
The Tower of London is one of the most haunted places in all of England.
The Tower of London was built in 1078 by William the Conqueror. It's one of the most important places in England. Like many castles in history, a lot of royals lived at this space. But at one point, there's a prison inside. There are dungeons, there are execution areas.
You could look at it and you would never think that this is where people were executed, let alone beheaded.
16th century at the Tower of London was a pretty brutal time with a lot of torture and executions. One of the most popular at the time was the rack, where people were essentially stretched until they're split in two.
One of the things that makes the Tower of London so infamous is the amount of ghosts that it's said to have. So there's a theory that it has at least 13 ghosts, and many of them are pretty well known. So you have figures like Anne Boleyn.
Anne Boleyn was the second wife of Henry VIII. She did not produce a male heir, and that meant she needed to go. And they couldn't get a divorce back then. And so Henry imprisoned Anne, and she was charged with a laundry list of reasons as to why she was imprisoned.
She was imprisoned in the tower and beheaded by sword there. After Anne Boleyn's execution, she was buried under Paris Church, and she laid there all the way up until Queen Victoria had her exhumed and gave her a proper burial.
she actually has been seen walking around holding her head. At one point, there's a story of one of the guards, the beefeaters, who saw burning light in the church that's on the property where Anne is buried. And he looked inside and he saw this procession of knights and ladies all being led by Headless Anne.
I went over to the area of the church where Anne Boleyn and other people who were executed, where they were buried, and I felt a cold chill. And as I was looking, I was trying to find the source of the chill, and as I looked, I saw an apparition walk by me, wearing a dress, but the only thing was, there was no head.
Nearly every room in the tower has been the site of a torture, a murder, or a bizarre death.
Henry VI was stabbed to death while he was praying. He had schizophrenia, so they called him the Mad King. There's whispers that Edward IV had him murdered, probably to take over his kingdom. He supposedly appears at the stroke of midnight in the very room he was killed.
One of the most gruesome executions at the Tower of London was Margaret Pole, who is the Countess of Salisbury. At that time, Henry VIII was kind of cleaning house. Anybody who was related or supported Anne Boleyn really met a fate of death. Margaret Pole woke up one morning and she was informed that she was going to die within an hour. And so when she went up to the gallows to be beheaded, she refused to kneel for the executioner. Because she refused to kneel, the first slash didn't behead her. And if you can envision Margaret Pole, a 67-year-old woman, running around the stage and the executioner hacking at her body, and that's how she was killed. The spirit of Margaret Pole haunts Tower Green, and how you know it's her is that you hear these blood-piercing screams because she's reliving her death.
Perhaps the most famous ghost, and the one with the saddest story, is Lady Jane Grey, who was murdered along with her husband, Lord Dudley, by her own grandmother, Mary Tudor, also known as Bloody Mary.
Lady Jane Grey is known to be the queen with the shortest range at just 9 days, before Queen Mary seized it from her, under the belief that the throne should only belong to a Catholic.
Lady Jane Grey is known as the 9 Days Queen. And actually, the last thing that Lady Jane Grey said before her execution was, "Don't worry, Dudley, we're going to be bound together in eternity." People see this lonely figure walking the battlements at night, and it's Lady Jane Grey. Her husband actually haunts as well. He's over in Beauchamp Tower, and he is crying for Jane.
There's also this ghost of a bear that belonged to Henry III. He collected an assortment of wild animals and held them in captivity to occasionally put them on display. The grizzly bear is often seen guarding the room where the crown jewels are kept.
It's just a hotbed of paranormal activity. It brings all of the paranormal experts out to see if they can capture some of the ghosts that are associated with the lore around the Tower of London. On the scary meter, it's gonna be pretty high up there because it has so many acclaimed and reported ghosts that if you want to encounter something, this is probably the place to be.
We're now down to our top 3 scariest places in the world. The most frightening, gruesome, and in some cases life-threatening locations. We're creeping ever closer to the #1 scariest place in the world. Up next on our list, a site in northern Ukraine that was ground zero to one of the deadliest nuclear disasters in history. A tragedy that left behind a ghost town, awash in lethal levels of radiation. and what has to be the most terrifying amusement park on Earth. Number 3, the ghost town of Pripyat, Ukraine. Founded in 1970, Pripyat was created as a community where people who worked at the nearby Chernobyl nuclear power plant would reside.
Pripyat was actually a thriving town of young professionals. It was growing, and it was a town of around 50,000 people.
And in 1986, the people of Pripyat were awaiting the opening of a new amusement park.
The Soviet Union did a lot of amusement parks, as weird as that might be when you think of their general characteristics in the Cold War. A lot of their efforts in the beautification were building these little amusement parks, these public attractions. They were doing the same for the residents of Pripyat. The amusement park itself consisted of about 5 different public attractions. It had a Ferris wheel, it had bumper cars, it had a big swing for people to play on, and a couple of carnival games that people could enjoy as well.
This amusement park was supposed to open on May 1st, 1986.
But that grand opening would never happen. On April 26th, just 5 days before the park was scheduled to open, a tragedy of epic proportions began to unfold. One that would directly and indirectly claim the lives of thousands.
A huge and catastrophic surge in power caused 2 explosions. As fires raged, the core of reactor number 4 was destroyed. A huge cloud rose into the sky, spreading large amounts of radioactive fuel and materials into the atmosphere.
So one of the nuclear reactors at Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded and caused a nuclear fallout with a radius of almost 20 miles.
The amount of radiation that escaped in Chernobyl was more than both the bombs dropped on Japan during the Second World War.
At first, the Soviet Union tried to cover up the explosion, but then workers and people in the surrounding areas started getting very sick.
The firemen and the liquidators were sent in knowing absolutely nothing of the dangers. Most of the first responders were dead within weeks.
Firefighters who rushed in to put out the blaze weren't properly equipped and suffered radiation poisoning. 48,000 people living in Pripyat were also victims of the ineptitude and secrecy of the authorities.
Chernobyl nuclear plant was about a 10-minute drive from Pripyat, where the amusement park was built. A lot of the plant scientists lived there with their families. Thousands of residents were evacuated after the explosion, but the evacuation didn't start for a day and a half, and the government withheld the reason for the mass exodus.
The way the wind blows, it blew radiation across to Scandinavia, and in fact, that's how the rest of the world was alerted.
The people were forced to evacuate the surrounding towns and area, and eventually just became a ghost town. It was just a huge disaster, and no one knew what the long-term effects would be because of the explosion. There's a lot of video games that feature Chernobyl, so a lot of young kids learned from the video games what really happened in the explosion.
There are several games in mainstream media that actually feature Chernobyl in a very big way. A lot of these children or adults that play these video games are able to explore and see exactly what Chernobyl would have been like during that time frame or even now.
Chernobyl amusement park makes its way into Call of Duty 4, Modern Warfare.
One of the most recent TV series about Chernobyl was HBO's Chernobyl 5-part series, which was absolutely fantastic.
I'm pleased to report that the situation in Chernobyl is stable.
No. One of the main characters in the TV series was a firefighter. And the storyline follows his deterioration from radiation sickness.
His name was Vasily. Unfortunately, he wasn't aware of the dangers of putting out this fire and how that fire was going to not only affect him in that moment, but in the long term as well.
He passed away from acute radiation sickness, basically massive burns inside and out. That level of radiation melts your internal organs, and it's a very slow and very painful death. He couldn't be touched by his wife. It was a very, very nasty way to go.
Besides the people who died, I think the aftermath was children getting leukemia and other illnesses. Cancer, hair falling out, exposure to radiation. Some people's skin melted away, so it was just a horrific scene. Over time, the rate of thyroid cancer in children increased by 90%, and that was just within the 5 years in Ukraine alone.
Some scientists do believe that the children were affected so harshly by this because of the livestock. The children were drinking the milk from the cows that were in that area.
Moss and grass absorbs radiation more than other plants, and the livestock were eating this, and therefore many were not fit for human consumption. One of the numbers of deaths is around 4,000 people, but no one knows the true number.
With the town of Pripyat permanently abandoned, the amusement park, now swimming in deadly radioactive material, never opened. Both this new nuclear ghost town and its truly lethal amusement park immediately became the stuff of legend.
To call the Pripyat amusement park decrepit is putting it lightly. They are falling apart. The paint is gone. The ceiling has largely fallen off in the bumper cars. Moss, vines, nature of all sorts is intertangling amongst it all and reclaiming the amusement park, much like it has most of Pripyat at this point.
As myriad TikTok and YouTube videos demonstrate, though the town of Pripyat and the amusement park are still abandoned, you can take tours of them if you dare.
There are many tour groups taking people to Chernobyl. You can pay about the equivalent of 50 euros and spend a day exploring parts of the zone.
The place looks really abandoned and really eerie.
Chernobyl definitely makes you feel very, very uneasy, not just in the buildings, but also just within the grounds of the entire area.
Radiation is the invisible enemy, as they say. You have to take certain precautions, wearing long sleeves and trousers, sturdy shoes that can be cleaned off at the end of the day.
You're not allowed to eat there. You're not allowed to touch anything. You're not allowed to even sit on the ground or any chairs that are still there, simply because it is just so dangerous. There's several different checkpoints that people have to enter and exit through just to make sure that that radiation isn't escaping from you to the population surrounding Chernobyl.
And of all the creepy sights in Pripyat, the amusement park receives the most reports of paranormal activity.
To the amusement park, people report hearing footsteps walking right through it as though somebody's coming home from work. They report seeing different items kind of taken off or falling off or being pushed around in the bumper cars, or seeing individual cars in the Ferris wheel kind of shake while they're just sitting there. It almost seems as though whoever it is that lost their lives there in the reactor, they are coming back occasionally and hanging out at the amusement park. So it's kind of proving a very popular theory that it could very likely get more haunted.
Adding to the terror of the amusement park is that roaming in and around it are the so-called demon dogs of Pripyat.
After breeding over many, many years, a lot of those dogs became feral. They are nuclear-powered dogs. They're still running rampant in that general area.
An abandoned amusement park inside an abandoned city, which was essentially wiped out by nuclear disaster. That's a plot of a horror movie right there.
8 heart-stopping, horrifying places down, 2 to go. Which of these places will top our list? An island populated entirely by dolls and said to be haunted by the spirit of a dead girl. Or an insane asylum that was home to unspeakable horrors, all carried out in the name of science. We're down to our top 2 scariest places in the world. But before we go down those dark corridors, let's check out a few more scary places that just barely missed our top 10. For sheer desperation and isolation, there may be no creepier place on Earth than Aokigahara, a wooded area at the foot of Mount Fuji in Japan. Known as the Suicide Forest, since 2003, more than 100 people have taken their lives in the woods here. And the spirits of the dead are believed to still be lurking among the foreboding jungle of cypress and hemlocks. And if Bran Castle didn't slake your thirst for tales of blood-sucking vampires, then let's take a trip to Laterata Nuovo Island, Italy, where rumor has it that a plague outbreak in the 17th century spawned a massive lockdown, which in turn gave rise to tales of disease-stricken, blood-sucking vampires roaming the island in search of victims. But it's another island that comes in at number 2 on our official list of the scariest places in the world. A haunted island that preys on a childhood fear that's been ingrained in horror movie culture and in the nightmares of more than a few children for decades.
Pediophobia is the fear of dolls or inanimate objects that look human but aren't exactly human. Anything from ventriloquist dolls, mannequins, or lifelike baby dolls definitely have the potential to scare the shit out of you if you have pediophobia.
Although dolls are meant to be toys for children, they've become something to be feared. There are plenty of scary movies about dolls, including Chucky, Annabelle, and most recently, Megan.
I think that dolls scare people because of the similarity to a human and also kind of the baggage that comes with it. They're very popular for horror film, for the doll coming to life, the doll being possessed.
You should probably run.
If malevolent dolls strike fear in you, why not couple them with a remote island where the only residents are the ghost of a dead young girl, the spirit of a man who tried to save her life, and the hundreds of desecrated baby dolls that keep them company. Welcome to Isla de las Muñecas, the island of the dolls.
Everything from stuffed animals like teddy bears to wolf babies is here in a creepy version. Some dolls are extremely creepy. When you look around, and some of them look like they're burned, some of them look like possessed.
Located in a remote swampland south of Mexico City, just getting to the island of the dolls is no small feat.
It takes 3-4 hours, 5 hours to come here just to do the boat, and I always tell everybody it's very worth visiting the Island of the Dolls, especially if you are mostly into the paranormal topic.
There is not a space that isn't covered with some type of doll, whether it is a baby doll, a Barbie doll, or antique dolls. That is what you will encounter when you step foot on the island.
How did the terrifying dolls end up on an island in the middle of nowhere? It all starts with a man named Don Julian Santana Barrera, who for nearly 70 years was the island's only living soul, and who in the 1950s had a horrifying encounter that changed his life and the island forever.
He happened to come across a girl who was drowned as she floated through one of the series of canals.
He tried to jump in and save her, but he was unsuccessful, and he watched her die.
Some say that she was about 11 years old on a school excursion or something like that and ended up wandering off away from the group and basically somehow ended up drowning.
Legend has it that the last thing she said was, "I want my doll."
Shortly after, in the same canal, a doll also washed up on shore, and he believed that the doll was hers.
Shortly after, this man started seeing shadows move and started hearing the crying of the girl. He believed this was the soul of the little girl that died.
To appease her spirit, he hung this doll up on a tree in order to honor her spirit.
But it seems the ghost of the dead girl didn't take kindly to Julian's offering.
He claimed that the spirit of this girl would just appear to him often and harass him and scare the hell out of him. He thought the only way to keep the spirit away was by hanging dolls.
Barrera kept hearing the girl say, "I want my doll, I want my doll." So it became his life's mission to collect these dolls and hang them up all over the island.
He even impaled heads of the dolls, almost like medieval style.
Of the 4,000 dolls on the island, none of them had names but one, and this one's name was Agustinita. This one was his favorite. It was rumored that she would walk around the island at night. Barrera would even leave plates of food as offerings for her at her special display case.
People started assuming that it was now the spirits of a ton of dead girls that were haunting these dolls. And the lore just started spreading outwards and outwards until this became kind of a scary place organically.
But it's Julian's own tragic death in 2001 that is perhaps the island's most terrifying tale.
He did pass away in 2001, and he was found in the exact same spot that the young girl died in.
Barrera actually died under mysterious circumstances. Some say he had a heart attack, that he committed suicide, or he drowned.
I'm not shocked that Barrera ended up passing in the exact same spot as the young girl, because he spent so much of his life trying to appease her, trying to ensure that she was at peace, that she was happy with the way the island was. And so to die in the exact same way, it's almost like his connection to her.
Today, people are welcome to tour the island at their own risk.
People who come from Mexico City and other areas to preserve Barrera's legacy in hanging these dolls, so they'll bring their own dolls, hang them up, and add to the island.
Tour guides swear that you can still hear the faint crying of the little girl. There have also been reports of people who have gone there who have seen the doll Agustinita walking around the island protecting it.
Today, paranormal posters on social apps are fascinated by the island, of which barely an inch isn't covered with dolls in all sorts of disturbing states of decay.
There have been reports on Island of the Dolls where people have said that they've seen eyes opening and shutting, they've seen body parts move, now adding in Barrera to the fold as well, and they believe that he still walks this island.
If an island full of demonic dolls and ghosts of little girls isn't enough to scare the bejesus out of you, perhaps our #1 location will. It's a place where real-world atrocities were carried out in the name of science, where medical malpractice and mental illness collided. A facility behind whose Gothic walls all manner of psychological torture took place. From Dracula's castle to the Island of the Dolls, we've counted down the most haunted, most fear-inducing, straight-up scariest places in the world. And now it's time for #1, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. Located in West Virginia, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum was the scene of some of humanity's most unthinkable horrors. All carried out in the name of modern medicine.
The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum was an insane asylum in the 19th and 20th centuries used to treat mental illnesses.
We opened our doors in 1864 when our first 9 patients came. Operated as a general mental facility until 1994.
It's a monster when you look at it.
The facility was only supposed to hold 250 patients, but by the 1950s, there ended up being about 2,400 patients there. Because of this, the living conditions at the facility suffered. Some people were locked in cages, these people were all over each other, and if your mental health is already struggling, this is not a great place to be.
The overcrowding often led the staff to practice non-traditional, and some might argue inhumane, methods to control the patient population.
Some of the horrific treatments might have been done just to keep people calm.
They thought that they were doing the most progressive treatment for these patients when they designed these facilities. Most notoriously are the transorbital lobotomies that occurred on site.
The man leading the charge on the procedures was the pioneer of the lobotomy himself, Dr. Walter Freeman, who conducted a series of what were essentially experimental surgeries at the asylum in 1939.
During a 2-week span of Dr. Freeman's stay here, it's projected about 500 people were lobotomized. So you can imagine the amount of people in here and the anguish that would have been felt.
They're absolutely brutal treatments. And for, you to not only be put in a place like this against your will, the lobotomy was often referred to as the murdering of the soul. There was no you left. You were like a robot or a zombie per se.
Outside of lobotomies, you had seclusion therapy, you had electroshock therapy.
From One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest to Shutter Island to American Horror Story. For decades, the type of disturbing medical practices conducted at Trans-Allegheny have served as an inspiration for some of film and television's most terrifying tales.
Are you ready? Here we go.
But at Trans-Allegheny, the truth of what transpired behind its walls is stranger and more frightening than fiction.
On top of the violence from the procedures that were standard at this time, there was violence among the patients in this facility.
Patients would turn on other patients. They would hurt each other. They would turn on the orderlies and the nurses. They would also start fires in the buildings. It was a place of chaos.
This is the seclusion area, and this is the stuff people think of when they think of an asylum. So this is where patients were chained up, and if you were a patient deemed to be rowdy or unruly, we would actually chain you standing in an X position with your wrists, your waist, and your ankles in a 5-point restraining system for hours to days. That's not only physical torture, but mental, and these people having legitimate mental issues as well, these rooms were often soundproofed. So you're not hearing anything except your own thoughts or maybe what's coming from outside your window. We had one guy remove the inner bars and just bang on the doors. To this day, his knuckle prints are still stuck in that door, and that's a solid steel door.
Over the course of its 130 years of operation, it's estimated that over 4,000 people perished within the walls of the asylum. And many believe the souls of those who died there still haunt nearly every room in the facility.
You die there with all these things that have been done to you. Now you've got a confused, dead, mental person that was tortured. What do you think's gonna happen?
There's so many different emotions and feelings that are just balled into this place, and it is like a huge cocktail for paranormal activity of every level, in my opinion.
When I give my paranormal tours, I always tell them, you have to appreciate what happened here to appreciate what you're going to experience.
Near the electroshock room, people are said to hear the sounds of screams and just the horrors of what the patients were enduring while they were being treated there.
No one knows more about the asylum's harrowing hauntings than the tour guides who work there today.
I walked every one of those hallways by myself at night at one time or another. I've had disembodied voices whisper my name when I'm walking by myself.
I was giving a tour. It was about 11:30 at night. It was a Halloween weekend, so we were allowed to dress up, and I was dressed up stupidly as Dr. Freeman and giving a tour through Violent Women's Ward, and my eye started hurting. The next day, my eye was swollen and it hurt to move, and it eventually became a black eye. These things can physically hurt people, and having that experience, it took me about a week before I felt comfortable going back in that ward.
When I first started here, I was a pretty far-sighted skeptic, but this place definitely made me a full-blown believer, absolutely no doubt. I have encountered so many different things in this building. The fourth floor is definitely the most active and the most intelligent, in my opinion. Most guides and guests would agree with that. It's probably the absolute paranormal hotspot for the entire building, if not the entire property.
It's here, evidenced in a video posted to social media by one visitor, that the spirit of a child housed on the asylum's fourth floor appears to be extremely active.
There's a very famous spirit here, and her name is Lily. She's a little girl. Guys, we found her. This is it. This is Lily's room.
One of the particular spirit is the creeper, is what he's referred to. And the reason he's referred to of that is because of the abnormal way that he moves. He is often seen kind of crawling across the floor. And it is, a disturbing vibe when you see, it's not just a regular human figure. It's somebody moving in an odd way.
So the murderer of the most brutal murder here at the asylum, when he passed away, he actually told the nurses at the hospital he went to that he's going to return here. Shortly after he passed away, in late 2010, 2011 era, we started seeing a black mass form down here at the end of the hallway. I've had one lady who was pretty sensitive, that she would not even come through the doorway. She said, something bad happened in there, I'm not going in. As she stands in the hallway, she screams bloody murder because that black mass was formed right beside of her.
We are in the criminally insane building. This building in itself gets disembodied moans and growls. We get knocking or tapping on the handrails going up the ramp. It's definitely a very active building. And this is most frequently where I am told to get out or to leave if I'm running audio or spirit box, something like that. It's notorious for kind of telling people, get out, leave, go away.
No matter which part of the asylum you're in, you're almost guaranteed to experience some sort of paranormal activity. And whether you embark on a day tour or dare to explore the asylum at night, you'll be sure to have a story to tell. If you make it out alive.
It's like a labyrinth. Once you're in there, if you don't know your way out, you're not getting out.
This asylum definitely lives up to its #1 rating because it has so many hauntings, so many apparitions, so many experiences. It's scary for what people have done to other people, but it's also scary in the paranormal sense.
So there you have it. The top 10 scariest places in the world.